Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is an unrehearsed look into my workflow. My name's Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, animator, and your pal, and I'm excited, just like every week, to have you back with me to make some cool stuff together. Now, this week I'm going to be combining my love of making silly character designs with my passion for landscapes, and we're going to be making sort of this anthropomorphized island. I assume a lot of you know what that means. Basically, anthropomorphized, if I can pronounce that correctly, is basically when you attribute human characteristics to non-human objects, frequently animals and stuff like that. Basically, when you put a face on stuff that isn't a person. So, as you can see here, we started with just a really basic sort of landscape setup. A couple of overlapping landscapes set onto a plane, which gives us this little island effect. And here I'm taking a capsule and adding, some funny little eyes and a smiling mouth on there. And this piece really evolved as I was working on it. I didn't have a super clear idea as to what I was going to make this week. And as I sort of worked on it and experimented and, started putting it together, I realized, sort of the direction it could take. And I didn't intend initially to create a face of the whole thing. Really what I thought I'd do was create a couple smaller little characters throughout the landscape. But, it's important to allow yourself to follow a whim when you're creating things. And sometimes the piece you wind up with isn't the piece you set out to make. And that's okay. That's a good thing. And I think that part of the benefit of establishing healthy creative habits is sort of catching lightning when it strikes, right? If you're not sitting there working, you're not going to have those breakthrough moments or those sort of aha mistakes that allow you to, create bigger and better work or have breakthroughs in your own work. So don't be afraid to experiment and don't be afraid to veer off course a little bit when it makes sense. So anyway, here we're adding a little beach area to the island. I took a little landscape and made it sort of mellow, turned down some of those furrows and made it kind of short and have this nice gentle rolling beach here. And as I'm adding that in, I figure I want to balance the composition a little bit and add it to different parts of the island to sort of draw your eye around with different pops of color. You'll notice that I really frequently, if not always, almost always, use groupings of threes in my work. I find that odd numbers are typically much more interesting, so these three sort of beaches work out nicely. I think that if you were to add another fourth one, it would feel perhaps more static and slightly less interesting as a composition. And so here we are, swapping and duplicating a character. And for this guy, I wanted to create sort of a little mushroom character. So you see what I'll do here is take a capsule and use various fall-offs on the soft selection to sort of scale it in and up and down. And what I'm doing here is growing the selection slowly and doing small transitions to create this sort of mushroom cap. Of course, creating the textures to go with that. Now, frequently I'll wait till much longer to start texturing. I like to, if I have a clearer idea of what I'm going to make from the onset, I typically try to resolve that in grayscale before going in and adding textures. But this one is sort of evolved as we worked on it, and I didn't have a 100% clear idea of what this piece was going to be, especially at this point, sort of in the early going. So I thought it would be okay to not only start texturing, but working on the composition and not doing super detailed texturing, but really just blocking colors in. Knowing that at this point we have this really smooth and flowing kind of hillside, I wanted to break that up a bit and juxtapose that with some sort of firm, pointy, rocky kind of crags. So the way I do that, and you've probably seen this in other episodes of this show, but I like to take a primitive in a separate file, put it in a Voronoi fracture object, and use that to split the object into a bunch of these little chunks. And I take the chunks back into the other file and sort of reposition them, and it gives you a really great little rocky effect there. So here we're just adding objects, repositioning, getting that composition working. Improving this little mushroom character here. It made sense to me to have this guy sort of be the king of the mushrooms here. So I created a duplicate and took the face off and made a bunch of copies of him and sort of created a little mushroom patch in this bottom right-hand corner of the island. This around this time is when it dawned on me that I could create a character out of this island. Initially, I thought it would be a couple of little characters around the island, and then I had the idea, hey, why don't we turn this whole dang thing into a smiling character? And so I make this really big, kind of goofy eye. And initially, I think, maybe I'll have the eyes off center and different sizes, but that felt a little weird. So here we go. I decided to just put a big old set of eyes, and we'll get into the mouth here shortly. And it was kind of fun and wacky, and it was a spur of the moment idea, but I'm pleased with how it worked out. So here we're making a simple little mouth, taking a circle spline and cutting it in half, basically, adding some chamfer, adjusting that there. There's a few too many points to have that sweep object be working nicely, but here you have it. Cute little mouth, giant eyes, anthropomorphized island, looking cool. And so at this point, roughly halfway through the creation process, I've got the idea down, I've got the basic composition down. Now it's about going through and fleshing out the details and tweaking stuff and getting it just right. Spend a little bit of time around this point, working on the lighting. I think an important component of the composition, especially this type of composition, can be the lighting and the way that it strikes certain objects and the way that it casts shadows on other objects. I was making an effort to have cast shadows be near items that stood above the shadows and sort of collected the highlights. You can see the top of the mushroom here. It's in a shadowed area, but it stands tall enough to catch some highlights on its top edge. And I think that that contrast in light and dark against each other works really, really nicely. Using some toruses here to create sort of a really kind of graphic interpretation of the hill. These are sort of like, it's obviously not realistic landscape components, but again, they're smooth and they juxtapose nicely against those rocks and against the straight up and down sides of the capsules. So I use a handful of those to add some interest, add some different shapes. Speaking of different shapes, let's throw a Bezier in there at this point. And similar to ways you've seen me create this elsewhere, I've made a little leaf shape. And I thought, since we're doing such a simple interpretation of a landscape, it would be fun to, instead of modeling out the whole plant, just do a really basic, simple little leaf here. Doing those in little groupings all around the island, it worked out pretty well. So you can see I'm positioning, tweaking, texturing. You see even there I've got 5 little leaves in a group. And I think that works compositionally. So copying 3 of those over to balance it out on the other side of the island. Another little grouping of 3. And see, now we're starting to get enough detail in the piece to have it feel satisfying and feel like a strong composition overall. lots of test renderings, obviously. One of the great things about cinema is the way you can sort of stack your renderings in that picture viewer and just go back and forth and really always be double checking and seeing if the changes you're making are in fact improvements. Now really, I mean, it can be at times a little bit overwhelming because the possibilities can be endless, and you think, oh man, was that even better? Which direction should I take this thing in? But really the options are there to make a piece just as strong as you can, and really just as much time and effort as you're willing to put into it. Really the options are kind of endless here. So you'll see I go back and forth a lot, and I'm always checking previous renderings to comparing them against the most current rendering, and even going all the way back into a piece and checking out the first renderings and comparing them to where we've progressed to. And here I figured at this point maybe it would be cool to have one more type of plant in here and one more type of character. So I decided to make sort of a little pine tree and throw a face on him there. So you see I started with the cone. I made a duplicate of one of our other characters because I wanted them to have similar faces. So here I'm adding a face to the cone. This will eventually become a little tree. Since I was copying it over, it took me a minute here to get things centered. Set up properly. Of course, things were angled funny. There's a little tree. We also wind up adding a little cylinder for a trunk. There it is. A couple other little pines. These ones without faces. Almost like we have a king of the mushrooms and a queen of the pine trees, perhaps. It's really turning out to be a fun little island here. And we're taking just a handful of additional capsules and bringing some of the sandy colored ones onto the green and some of the green ones onto the sandy color areas. I wasn't 100% satisfied with the smoothness of some of the landscapes, so I threw those in a subdivision surface to get nicer fall off on the lighting over the edges of these hills. I bump up the size of the output, and off we go into our final rendering. Really happy with how this thing is coming together. It's simple, there's not a ton of colors, there's not a huge amount of geometry, but it came together pretty nicely. And what I'm noticing here, and unfortunately I didn't notice until after I finished recording, was that one of my rock pieces was left untextured. I didn't take that out of or I didn't add it to the appropriate group. So anyways, that's a mess. And then what I've done here is gone ahead and cropped the composition because it wasn't really working well. And some last minute color tweaks. And there's our finished piece. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to drop one in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, please check me out on Instagram at DLGNCE. And until next week, this is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks.